Mhm.
Okay, now it's recording, so feel free to take it back off. We are good.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Monica Samuel. I'm a recent graduate of the Institute of Impacted Leaders. I recently signed up to be a facilitator for the Institute, but it's been put on hold due to the COVID. My husband is serving a 15 to life sentence, and he's been in for 25 years. And I'm just fighting for his freedom and freedom for others as well. And yeah. Did you hear me? No? Yes? Sorry.
All right, I guess I'm unmuted, so I'll go next. Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up and attending. My name is Adnan Khan. I serve as the Executive Director of Restore Justice. At the age of 18, I was charged and then eventually sentenced to 25 years to life. After serving 16 years and the passage of Senate Bill 1437, I was released, and I've been out over a year. I was released last year in January. And pleasure to meet everyone here.
So thank you both for introducing yourselves. And we wanted to do a little bit of an icebreaker, which is really difficult to do when you are on a video call. But if everyone can open up, click their participants tab, and there you will be able to click the more option and raise your hand. And so when prompted, if it applies to you, then please raise your hand. So if you have served time, or if a loved one of yours is currently or formerly incarcerated and they have served, wait, don't raise your hands yet, hold on. So if you have served time and or your loved one is currently or formerly incarcerated and they have served, or you have served more than 5 years, please raise your hand. Thank you. So I'm going to lower all hands. So again, if you have served time or your loved one has served time for more than 10 years, please raise your hand. Thank you. I'm going to lower all hands. So if your loved one has served more than 15 years, please, again, raise your hand. Okay. Again, I'm going to lower the hands. So again, if you or your loved one has served more than 20 years, please raise your hand. Thank you. And last one, I'm lowering the hands. If you or your loved one has served more than 25 years, please raise your hand. Thank you. So I'm lowering all hands. So as we can see, several people raised their hands. You know, people have served 5, 10, 20, 25 plus years. And just within this space, we have all experienced extreme sentencing and served hundreds of years collectively. And so that's why it's so important to have conversations like we're going to have tonight, so that we can end extreme sentencing and bring our loved ones home. So let me define extreme sentencing. It's the interconnected system of punitive policies that are often rooted in systematic racism, such as mandatory minimums, and it transfers juveniles to the adult court system, and it expands sentences based on prior history in the carceral system, and it creates barriers to parole. So let's talk about this a little bit more. 1 in 3 people in California prisons are serving a life or virtual life sentence. Let me read it again. 1 in 3 people in California prisons are serving a life or virtual life sentence. That is crazy. And because of that, we have one of the highest extreme sentencing rates in the country. So let's break it down a little bit and see how people in California are actually sentenced to life. So we have indeterminate sentences. An indeterminate sentence is a sentence that has a set number of years to life. For example, 25 years to life. So once that person has served 25 years, at that point, they are eligible to go to the parole board. They may not go home because they have to prove to the parole board that they are suitable. Oftentimes, people go to the parole board, they're denied for 3, 5, 10 years. They come back, they're denied again. And so they essentially spend life in prison. Like Monica shared earlier, her husband had a 15-year life sentence. He served 25 years so far. So currently, there are 27,328 people who are serving an indeterminate sentence in our prisons in California. 1 in every 4 women in prison are serving life. And then there are 43% of the people who are serving life sentences are Black. And the opposite of indeterminate sentencing is determinate sentencing. So that means if you're sentenced to 2 years for residential burglary, then after the 2 years, you go home. And again, indeterminate sentencing is a set number of years to life. And so the set number of years is when you will be able to go to the parole board. Then there's the virtual life sentence. A virtual life sentence is a life sentence that extends past the person's expected life expectancy. So for example, if as a Black woman, I am only expected to live, I believe, 75 years. And so if I was given a 110-year sentence, that is a virtual life sentence. Then we have people who are condemned, which I absolutely hate the term, but these are the people who are sentenced to be put to death for whatever their offense was. Currently, there are 722 people who are considered condemned and are on death row. Currently, our governor, Governor Newsom, has did a moratorium, and so he's put a stop to anybody being executed or being sentenced and put on death row. But unfortunately, when we get a new governor, things can change. The next sentence that we're going to talk about is life with the possibility of parole. It's often called LWOP. And this basically means that if you do not win an appeal, you do not get your sentence commuted, or the laws don't change, then unfortunately you are sentenced to live out the rest of your days until you pass in prison. Absolutely horrible. Currently, there are 5,117 people who are serving LWOP sentences. And then you have the extreme sentence of the 3 strikes law. Currently, there are 7,000 people who have been struck out under the 3 strikes law. Being struck out means that you have received 3 strikes, and the strikes are if you have past in your history of what they would consider violent, then you can receive strikes. And so if you get 3 strikes, then you are automatically sentenced to at least 25 years to life. And like I shared about my husband, you can have enhancements added to that and compounded on your sentence and giving you more time. So let's talk about enhancements. These are when there are certain conditions that will prompt a judge to give you more time and add it to either your determinate or indeterminate sentence. So you have a 5-year prison prior enhancement, or sometimes you might hear it called the nickel prior enhancement. And that is a 5-year term that is added onto your sentence for each time you've been in prison. Then there is a firearm. If there's a firearm that's attached to your offense, then they can add more time for having a firearm. Or if you have some type of affiliation, or you know someone in a gang, or you live near a gang, then they can add time to you for that. Or if there was a minor present or a minor victim, then they can add time for that. There was the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act that was signed into law by President Clinton in 1994, which basically incentivized the states to expand their correctional facilities and add additional time to people's sentences and require them to make people serve at least 85% of their sentences. And so, as we can see, as a result, we have these extremely long sentences because there were actually grants that were given to the different states to expand incarceration. And extreme sentences, for some people, for a lot of people, can be a permanent punishment. As I talked about earlier, it can be a barrier to parole. So just because you have an opportunity to go before the parole board does not mean that they will grant you parole or find you suitable to go home. One thing that I personally don't like about the parole board is that it's completely subjective, right? People have the authority to determine whether or not I have been rehabilitated. And so, again, a lot of people get denied for several years. And then there are parole conditions if they are released. So oftentimes you have to pay restitution within a certain time frame. Otherwise, you can possibly be reincarcerated. Or you might have to pay your supervision fees for being on parole. And there are other fees that might be attached to what you have to pay when you're released. And then oftentimes there are barriers to employment and housing. You might have your immigration status threatened. And you are also, sorry, I just see that typo. Oftentimes there are other disqualifications to benefits. And as a result, many people remain in poverty and repeat the cycle of recidivism. So I'm going to go ahead and play a video because we're going into how do we get here. And after the video, Monica's going to take over and kind of go over a brief history of how we got to the place of these extreme sentences.
Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration. The chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high. Mass incarceration means that we've got a a very high rate of incarceration historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated. We're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about Black men who were born in the late 1970s and who were growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of Black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. That's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9. The research shows the kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out. And there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
You hear me now? Okay. I'm going to read, good evening, everybody. I'm going to read a quote by John Legend. It says, mass incarceration is a policy that's kind of built up over the last 4 decades, and it's destroyed families and communities, and something we need to really change. And it's fallen disproportionately on Black and brown communities, especially Black communities. And it's kind of a manifestation of structural racism. And now we're going to go into the Reconstruction Era with the next slide. The Reconstruction Era, the end of slavery was a threat to American economics and our capitalist system. In the first half of the 19th century, slavery had become so profitable, people were enslaved, were legally designated as property. When buying and selling the people, there was a sales tax included, which was very, very sad. At the start of the Civil War, if the Confederacy had been a separate nation, it would be ranked the 4th richest in the world. Slavery by another name. The Southern economy was destroyed after the war, and the Reconstruction Era was to reconstruct the country, would continue to fuel our capitalist economy. And then convict leasing came into play, made it possible to buy and sell labor of people serving time in prison. The 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution and made convict leasing possible. I'm going to read the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So After that, after years of convict policing in the Jim Crow era, we get to the tough on crime era. Politicians on both sides of the aisle used fear-mongering and enforced punitive policies that were racially motivated. Richard Nixon declares war on the drugs, and in the Black communities, there were extreme differences between using crack and in the white communities using cocaine. In the sentences handed down, they were extremely heavier using crack than cocaine. And with the Reagan Just Say No on drugs, and the Clintons reinforcing, expanding these punitive policies with their slogans calling in the communities super predators, and establishing the 3 strikes law. And in the 80s, we see an uptick amount of the years issued in sentencing. I think it's the next slide. Extreme sentencing is a key factor in mass incarceration, and the prison overcrowding with decades of harsh and extreme sentencing have left us with the world's highest incarceration rate. And all this to say, we need change. We have to do something about it and find better ways to do things. And I'm going to hand it over to Adnan so he can explain a little bit about a better way of doing.
All right, thank you. Is there another, yeah, next slide. Okay, so this comes a little bit, when we talk about extreme sentencing, it says Finland here, but briefly want to talk about my trip I took to Norway back in September. So this trip to Norway was put together by doctors, and the group is called UCSF Amend, A-M-E-N-D. And what they did was they got 30 people, 30 delegates from California, the head secretary, Ralph Diaz, Connie Gibson, who works within CDCR. We also had 4 legislators, senators, and assembly members that came with us. We had 3 members of the CCPOA, which is the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. They're 3 top heads. Then we had 2 people from the governor's office as well, which is Kelly Evans and Dan Seaman, for those who know. And then there were a few other advocates, and I was very privileged to be invited to go on that trip as well. And we went for a week, and we learned a lot of things there. And been all over like 10 p.m. every day with each other, depending on during breakfast, lunch, and dinners, all the way to the facilities that we traveled to on the bus, the training facilities. So thinking about Norway and what I want to tie in with extreme sentencing, first I want to talk about, and about 20 years ago, Norway actually had a very, very similar results of recidivism and violence within the prison system. So race riots, their correctional officers, they had correctional officers who were murdered inside the facilities. They had a 70% recidivism rate in that country. And mind you, I don't want to make any type of comparisons, and I always say this when I talk about Norway, to the United States, in terms of I completely understand it's a homogenous country. They don't have the history of systemic oppression and slavery that Monica just got done telling us. So not to make those comparisons and say that we can do similar to Norway, but there were some eye-opening things that we could look into and how they changed their system. So some of those similarities of the recidivism rate, some of those similarities of the riots that were happening inside, the way they changed it when their parliament, which is their government, their legislators, senators, assembly members, essentially, they said, we need to do something about our prison system. Like, this is not working. And after they did a lot of studies, the legislator basically came down, put a hammer down when a legal document was called the White Papers in 1997, I believe. And what they did was they said, you need to change your prison system. And one of their focuses was changing correctional culture. So comparison to the California in particular, when a correctional officer goes to training, the correctional officer pretty much just needs a GED, and they go through a 13-week, sometimes 90-day training. And that training consists of use of force. It's not de-escalation. It's not communication, how to fire a gun, how to file paperwork if you literally shoot someone in a facility, how to file paperwork after you, and how to cut down a noose in a cell. Is very transactional. It's very technical. And again, like I said, use of force and literally control and power, how that's used, all the way down to how to use your voice to speak louder, speak literally with a deeper voice. And that's the only type of communication that's taught in the United States, but in particular California. So again, a 13-week, maybe a 90 days, depending on when you were trained, training for correctional officers. As opposed to Norway. So first of all, Norway in their prisons, they don't carry, the officers don't carry guns. They don't carry pepper spray. They don't carry batons. They don't even carry handcuffs. They do have handcuffs, but they have handcuffs like in a locked box. And if the situation gets out of hand, then someone, calls in for the handcuffs. And so the reason for that is that when Norway does their training for officers are not just military people. I asked one of the correctional officers, the hiring officers, hey, what do you look for besides the obvious in the resume and paperwork? What do you look for when hiring a new recruit? And impulsively or immediately he said, empathy. So the quality of type of people that they're looking to hire are people who already come in with empathy, not necessarily a military background. On top of that, the cadets and the trainees have to go through and again, this came from Parliament to make these changes. The cadets have to go through a 2-year full pay training course for 2 years full pay. And in this training course, they have to take classes and pass in exams in subjects like ethics, human rights, law, I think it was sociology. And on top of that, the whole training is rooted in communication. And so they had this inverted pyramid. And when we went to Cruise is their training facility with actual cadets. And we were like kind of spy on the wall, or literally we were in that training facility with them. And they had this inverted pyramid. And on the bottom, it was like is step 1, and all the way on the top was step 10. And step 10 was the use of force, where you would have to take somebody down. This is the Norway teaching. And step 1 through 8 or 9, it was just all communications. So with that, having said that, like they focused on that training and they slowly started to change the prison system. But in the same vein, the Parliament realized, and this is where the extreme sentencing is tied in, that you cannot just simply change a culture and correctional culture and offer rehabilitation and proper reentry without changing your extreme sentences. And so that's when they literally capped sentences to 21 years. Now there is a loophole, 21 years later, you go to their version of the parole board, you can get denied, and technically you can spend the rest of your life in prison, but that's very, very, very rare in Norway today. But the point is that they realized, and mind you, I'm sharing this and this information is being shared by their parliament and their wardens in the facilities to our California legislators, 4 of them at least that were there with us. If I could name them, it was Elena Durazo, it was Assemblyman Kumlager, Reggie Jones Sawyer, and Rebecca Bauer Kahan. Those are the 4 legislators that were there in Norway with us in our trip. And so that sparked a lot of conversation about just this idea of extreme sentencing. Yeah, what is the purpose of changing a prison system inside when people are going to spend all these years in virtual life sentences and extreme sentences in prison? It just doesn't logically make sense. So with that in Norway, they do practice restorative justice. They do cognitive behavior programs, social learning theory. In Norway, I want to add in here, yes, they have shorter sentences, and it says incarceration emulates normal life. So in Norway, their idea of reentry starts day 1 of incarceration. And so their whole goal is to prepare you from the moment you get incarcerated to prepare you to go home. And that could mean the mental health, that can mean trauma therapy, that can mean all sorts of things, as well as employment, proper employment. And I'll give a quick example. There was a guy, so I was privileged to share a panel on one of the days with one currently incarcerated Norwegian person and one formerly incarcerated Norwegian person. And on this panel, he was there for a murder, he was there for a homicide, and he was literally transferred from another facility to come to this halfway house, which is also their version of lower level prison, and do this panel with us. Like, he was transferred from another prison and also he works. So for the past 2 years, he's already 13 years into his sentence. For the past 2 years, he drives trucks. It started with an hour, 2 hour local deliveries while incarcerated, by the way, full pay. he has a trust account in the prison. He's getting paid. The restitution thing is not like how it is over here. And then he eventually got to 4 hours, and then he does full time. He drives trucks and he comes back to the facility and he finishes out his sentence. So that's the idea of the re-entry part, the taking care of people while they're inside. If I could jump to the next slide, because I really want to I just want to build context for that, but it goes hand in hand with extreme sentencing. So come back here to America, in California, with the little buzz that was happening. I just want to say to the ACR 186, it was a resolution, which is basically we wanted to start a conversation within our California legislature to say that, hey, extreme sentences and life sentences, we want to have a conversation that there's something wrong with it. That's all a resolution is. A resolution is not a bill, it's not a ballot measure. However, they can turn into ballot measures and bills. But the idea is just to start having that conversation to acknowledge that there's something wrong with extreme sentences in particularly our state. So unfortunately, are we already, am I past time? No, okay. Sorry, I'm seeing the screen here. Let me know, I could talk. So if I'm going too much, tell me, shut up. You can just type it if you don't want to say it. I'll read the text. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so so when we came back here, it was actually Assemblywoman Lager who was on this trip with us. That fire, I guess you could say, about the parliament and 21-year cap, it was still lit. And so the idea came up, hey, let's do a resolution on extreme sentences. And then Taina reaches out, Initiate Justice, and we partnered up in just starting this resolution or this conversation on extreme sentences in the legislature. And unfortunately, COVID happened. And then unfortunately, because of that, the ACR, which you see here, 186, the resolution was dropped by Assembly member Lager. For now, their priority right now in the legislature, from what I'm hearing, has been unemployment and financial aid. So maybe in 2021, we could return to this. However, the idea was the stuff that we were putting on this resolution, basically, it was listing out different types of facts, numbers, statistics on mass incarceration, but tied to specifically the harm of extreme sentences. So one of the things that, for example, we mentioned in this actual 186 resolution, ACR 186 resolution, was that there are currently more people serving life sentences than the entire prison population of 1970s, right? With a 590% increase in the national prison population since 1980. So like right there off top, we just started off by saying like there are more people serving just life sentences than the entire population in 1970s. And then in 1970s, a life sentence was 7 years to life. And on average, people served about 13, 14 years on average in the 70s. So crime rates are actually lower than they were in the 70s. However, and obviously the population today is higher. So why is our sentencing so extreme? Like it just like these are just facts and numbers. Like you know, we always talk about making arguments to the government, making arguments to legislators, and even people who are in opposition to any type of reform or abolition. And a lot of those arguments can be, hey, our loved ones and they're human beings. And sadly and unfortunately, those human being arguments don't always sit well with everyone, or people don't care about human beings, sadly. And a lot of those people are in positions of power and decision-making abilities. So when you have to hit them with numbers. And so that's what this resolution was doing, was saying that, you know, despite another one we wrote, despite historic declines in crime rates, life sentences are still at an all-time high, with more than 200,000 people serving life sentences nationwide. And so we're bringing the national context. Why are there so many people, even though crime rates are declining, why are there more people serving longer and extreme sentences? You know, mentioned earlier, 1 in 3 people are serving long and virtual life sentences. One thing I want to add to that conversation of virtual life and the life expectancy, here's a very sad statistic that really shook me when I read it. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, each year in prison that a person is incarcerated, it actually takes off 2 years of that individual's life expectancy. So every year that you serve in prison takes off 2 years of an individual's life expectancy. So when we have this idea or this number, or, you know, the statistic of what a virtual life sentence technically is, it's actually much less than what the data shows, because of this very, very number that every year 2 years are taken off life expectancy of an individual that's incarcerated. Let me read this text in case. Nope, I'm not in it. Sorry, just thought it was for me. And so that's the idea of extreme sentences, that $13 billion a year here in California that we all on this call who pay taxes have to pay for, with a nationally 70% recidivism rate. And recidivism is directly linked in many parts to lack of housing and employment, which is also the government's responsibility. But if there's and I mentioned this yesterday on one of the talks, was if there's a 70% recall rate for a car, wouldn't that car company be shut down? The Better Business Bureau would come knocking down the doors of that company and shut that company down because it is unsafe for people. For example, if there was a meat company that's selling meat and they had a 70% recall rate because the meat is unhealthy and not safe for public consumption, that business by the FDA would be shut down immediately. However, when it comes to incarceration, our prison system, $80 billion a year nationally, with a 70% recidivism rate, nothing's being changed. And therefore, extreme sentencing, and not just mass incarceration, I also want to highlight this term that we've been using, is static incarceration, which means people are not coming home, right? Prisons are being filled. Yes, people are coming in and out of there, but the truth is, as people are serving longer and lengthier and life sentences, prisons are being filled with people who are static, who are stuck there. And so as we talk about mass incarceration, like the volume, I think it's very important for all of us in our narratives to talk about static incarceration as well. So the thing I want to highlight, just for now, I know we're going to get into some Q&A, or if there's any other questions or something you all that are on this call, Zakiya or Tanya or Monica, you want me to expound on, I'll be willing to. But I kind of want to just slightly close out there.
Thank you, Adnan. So at the beginning of the call or the webinar, I asked you to grab some paper and write down any thoughts, questions, or epiphanies that you might have throughout. And so, Tina, I unmuted you. Are we gonna unmute people or just have them put it in the chat box?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to facilitate the Q&A is if folks can just put their questions in the chat box, and then Zakiya, you can go ahead and read them out. And if folks have any specific questions for Monica, Zakiya, or Adnan, you can write that in the chat, and then folks can respond. Otherwise, I think, anybody who feels comfortable responding to the question can go ahead and do that. So I'm already seeing some questions starting to pop up. So Zakiya, feel free to facilitate.
Alrighty. Somebody Adnan to leave his number. But let's see. Ivy has a question. In Norway, did they also provide any sort of psychological, emotional, and/or trauma support services? I think Adnan, that's for you.
Yeah, in short, yes, they do have that. They do provide that, and they also prioritize that. What we found kind of shocking was that because of the treatment, the humane treatment, and again, I had to kind of like divorce my understanding of my 16 years experience with correctional officers, with
what is that?
How.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so I had to divorce like my understanding of what a correctional officer meant in my experiences with correctional officers in the prison system in California versus how they view and what the role of the officer in Norway was. So though, yes, they do prioritize psychological, emotional, and trauma support services, but the overall humane treatment really added to the the defenses, I guess you could say, going down on all sides of people who either work or live there. I'll give a quick example. I remember I wrote an op-ed about a while back about, okay, you could provide all these type of rehabilitative programming inside our prison facilities, which is important. But then as soon as I step out of this class, I'm stepping into a war zone. And you know, with a barrage of like violence from correctional officers and verbal violence and physical violence, intimidation, and all those techniques that are used, that's further traumatizing and equating it to a person that returns back from military returns back from war. And as they are going through their PTSD, psychological or training therapy services, as soon as they walk out that door, it's like you're throwing them back into the war zone they just came back from, which does not make sense. And so one thing Norway understood that, to where we can't just put you in therapy or class. We also have to make an environment that sustains those feelings and thoughts.
Right. Thank you. There's another question about your experience in Norway. Are there barriers to re-entry in Norway, and if you know about Finland, like we have here?
I think there's barriers which are very little. I think I'm not going to speak from my limited experience. I remember them talking about where the individuals. So Norway is a long country geographically, and so people are from all over Norway, and they have family all over. And so there's places that are like in the Norway is known for their hiking and camping and their wilderness. So there were some stuff like the locations where people want to return to, they didn't necessarily provide jobs there. So that was a one example that I could think of, at least right now in my head. And I'm not sure if that's a fault on anyone. That's just, I don't know if it's a geographic location that didn't offer specific jobs for that individual. Because a lot of that stuff would end up being farming and yeah, but that's the only example I have off the top of my head. I would need to do more research, and I don't want to give you any false information.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a question about becoming a member to work with the organization. We'll circle back to that question a little bit later. But what type of policies can we propose that you learned from Norway that would move towards ending mass incarceration, and which of legislators or attendees were in support of the types of resources provided by Norway?
First, I'll answer the last part first. What legislators, the 4 that were on our trip, they were, honestly, to be completely honest with you, at least at that time, everybody that was on that trip was sold that we need to do something with our system here. I think the bureaucratic red tape has been a huge problem coming back. However, I will say that specifically the legislators, the 4 of them that were with us, they were on board, and they're still on board from what I hear. The other part, the top part of your question, you said, what type of policies can we propose? I think that it's definitely policies. This resolution was one, like we need to cap sentences or we need to get rid of extreme and life sentences, right? I just want to general blanket that. But I think the most important way to do that is we have to start talking about violence and not normalizing violence, but humanizing people and understanding why people commit harm. What are the drivers of violence, right? That's where we need to start speaking from. I always share my story of I went from an 8-year-old Little League baseball player to an 18-year-old with a life sentence. How does that happen? How does an 8-year-old Little League baseball player go to an 18-year-old with a life sentence? What are some of those traumatic events in a child's life that were unmet, that were not met by society or programs or therapy, and kind of put the burden back on society, but really to humanize like people, and also understand that violence is reactionary based on traumas, and that people that act out violently aren't just inherently violent. That's a bigger problem that we have, that people think that people are just evil or they'll never change, that they're like that word incorrigible, irredeemable. So we have to humanize people. And we need to start talking about, seriously, murder. We need to start talking about people losing their lives and what accountability means. Those things, in my opinion, need to come out more and more and more. So therefore, we can not shy away when we talk about extreme sentences. We can't just pick the low-hanging fruit. We have to go big. We have to, like I talk about my, and this is from his consent. my coworker, Phil Melendez, he committed a double homicide and he is out now. And so his work is like, look, I am redeemable, and this is how I did it, and this is how I'm a human being, and this is how someone like me can, who was a little kid who cried when watching Bambi, to a point where I can, at 19 or 18 years old, kill someone. So as a society, to really, really highlight how, you know, what are the drivers of violence, and highlight trauma inside people.
Thank you. So the next question we have, has this pandemic created any opportunities to expedite this movement to end extreme sentencing? Tina, maybe you can chime in as well.
Yeah, sure. Can y'all put that on pause for a second? Sorry, multiple people working in one room over here. Yeah, so folks may be aware that on social media, Initiate Justice, alongside many other organizations, have been pushing Governor Newsom to release people from prison in light of the COVID-19 crisis, specifically calling on him to release people who are elderly, who are medically vulnerable, or folks who are, you know, considered by CDCR to be low risk to safely re-enter society. So this has been a really important opportunity for us to talk about the fact that we have way too many incarcerated people, even though, you know, I guess we're technically at less than the 137.5% cap now. Our prisons are still severely overcrowded and unprepared to respond to a serious crisis such as what we have now. So we have been, you know, trying to use this as an opportunity to talk about, as Adnan was speaking on earlier, you know, stagnant sentences. So extreme sentencing results in people being in prison for incredibly long periods of time, past the point where, you know, they are, you know, any longer a threat to society. I'm sure that, you know, anything that any of us did 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago are behaviors and patterns that would not be an issue for us anymore. And yet, because our system is so punitive and focuses on punishment versus transformation and redemption and healing, we have folks in prison. I don't want to say who don't need to be, because I'm a prison abolitionist and feel like nobody needs to be in prison, but we clearly have a situation where we can safely release folks, and that isn't happening. So really right now, like, this is an opportunity to talk more about that, to talk about what safety actually looks like, which is, you know, having folks like safely home in the communities to stop the spread of a pandemic, to have folks being able to re-enter and contribute to society in positive ways. So I would say that, you know, it's really important for us to talk about extreme sentencing in the wake of COVID-19 through the lens of the fact that we just have folks there too long and it's not actually improving public safety.
As a follow-up, is there like any type of roster or anything like that where we have showing like all of these people are quote unquote low risk, all of these people are also immunocompromised, that we can hold CDCR accountable, because we have a list of several people that should be released in light of COVID-19?
I believe the CDCR has that data. I'm not sure, Adnan, if you're aware of like where we can get that data.
So when we look at that, when you say there's a list, there's different lists because of so many different demographics in prison, right? So there's about 54 people right now that have already went to parole board and were found suitable, that the governor hasn't signed, and they're just waiting for their 150. Actually, one of them's above 150. So 450 is a very small number, but that is a lifer population. And 450 people are also a lot of people that can be home, 450 people to their families. That's one. There's another one. When we talk about safety, I think one of the, if I could just take a step back and talk about the problem that what I'm hearing is coming from the governor's office and some of the fear. Obviously, he's doing politics over people right now, or else he would reduce the prison population safely. But as we talk about reducing the prison population, I think as advocates, it's very important for us to not just, yes, talk about reducing the prison population, but equally in the same breath, talk about proper financial aid and safe housing. And the reason I say that is because not only are people coming back in a pandemic, people are returning back into society, into our communities in the midst of financial crisis, right? So when people do get out, they actually won't have, a lot of people won't get jobs. 20+ million people in the past 3 weeks have been laid off in America. And so when we talk about reducing the prison population, what are some ways that we can, if and when we approach the governor, to come with the full kit? And what that means is, hey, look, here's housing. And what we've been doing at Restore Justice and reaching out is like trying to be a little bit more creative and reach out to unused churches, mosques, and synagogues and see if they can kind of like, you know, step up and provide shelter and clothing and feed people, and be creative in creating those spaces for people returning back into our society if they don't have a place to stay. Also, I want to say that pre-COVID, 30% of people that are released from prison end up homeless. So which means that 70% actually have a place to go. And then 30% is the one we should really be focusing on as well. I mean, we should focus on everyone, but particularly those that don't. So looking at these churches, mosques, and synagogues, and locally all the way up and down California, from San Diego, LA area, Fresno Bay area, Sacramento area, see who can provide that. And then the next thing is the financial aid. Now, do we reach out to, for nonprofits? Do we reach out to our funders? Do we reach out to people who can donate? How much? You know, so that is coming from private funding, meaning from regular philanthropists. But there's also a push for the governor and the state to provide financial aid. And one of the angles that we're still trying to find we run into bureaucratic red tape is the gate money. So the $200 gate money from California, when you're released, every person that's released from state prison in California gets $200 debit card. And they're like, you know, good luck. So that was actually an amended bill in 1973, and 1973 or 76. I need to do my research on the exact date, but one of those dates in the 70s, it was an amended bill from $350 to $200. They reduced it to $200. And according to the inflation calculator today, that $200 in 2020 is $1,200. But that number has never changed in 40+ years. And so when we look at like financial aid, one coming from private funders in response to COVID now, and approaching the governor with the entire kit, it's important to look at private funders, but as well as the government's responsibility. How do we change that? Is it, you know, what I'm running into is CDCR is saying, you know, no, that's not a policy. That's because it was an amended bill. You have to go to the legislator. Legislator is saying, no, they could do it within the CDCR correctional policies. So now I'm going back and forth with that. But the truth is, like, there's ways where both can provide financial aid and safe and proper housing when people do return. So once we have that like in our back pocket, then when we go to the governor with the ask, it's almost like, I'm not saying he's going to do it, but it's safe for him. I want to say his political aspiration. It's sad to say that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. So someone wants to know how they can be more involved in prison reform and advocacy when they're out of state. I know it's difficult because they're not able to vote on our policies here, or maybe not lobby as a constituent. But Taina, let's see, do you have any suggestions? I'm getting to unmute you.
Yeah, and for all the folks who are asking questions around, you know, like what can I do specifically around ending extreme sentencing, I'm gonna put out a call to action towards the end of the call. But just in general, if you're out of state and you want to get more involved, something that I think is always really useful is still, like, you know, contacting legislators here. So even if, you know, you're not necessarily in their district, you can contact folks who are like the chairs of the committee, so like Public Safety Committee or Appropriations Committee. If bills are moving through those committees, you know, also feel free to contact the governor when bills are waiting to be signed, and, you know, just share your story. Just, you know, let them know, like even though I don't live in the state of California, I have a loved one who is incarcerated there. I would even recommend reaching out to the legislators who represent the district where the prison is located, where your loved one is at, because they're, you know, accountable for your loved one, even though, you know, they're not able to register to vote, but they still are a constituent. They are still counted. So I would say, you know, still familiarize yourself with legislators in California and reach out and use your voice.
Thank you. And I see someone asked if more people have been released. I know that there was the first wave of people, I think it was like 3,500 people who were supposed to be released. I'm not sure if all of them have been released or if there have been any others who are supposed to be released. Do either of you know, Adnan or Dana? No. Let's see. Are there any resources that we can recommend to be more informed? Articles, books? I believe. Well, there's going to be a specific call to action, and I know there's going to be something that Initiate Justice is putting together that will be a resource for other folks. But do either of you know of any current resources for folks who just want to kind of learn more about this and become more involved?
I would definitely recommend checking out the Restore Justice website. Adnan had mentioned the op-ed that he wrote, and there's like lots of other like good articles and resources on that website, particularly around you know, ending extreme sentencing and releasing people in the wake of COVID-19. On the Initiate Justice website, we also have like blogs and articles written by some of our directly impacted staff members or members who are incarcerated. So those are always good resources. But if you just want to learn more about, you know, like changing the prison system, or something else that I should also mention on the Initiate Justice website, our board member, Richard, also went to Finland and Norway in September of last year and wrote an op-ed on his experience there and lessons that he learned. So I would recommend visiting the Initiate Justice website and checking out Richard's op-ed. But if you just want to learn more about like alternatives to incarceration period and prison abolition, a really good place to start is a book called Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. Really short, accessible read, good place to get going.
Thank you. Adnan, a question for you. Can you explain the correlation between the facts that longer sentences do not deter crime and the low recidivism rates for people who have served long life sentences?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main things that sticks out is like factually, people, quote unquote, what they say is age out of crime, right? So crime happens impulsively. It happens when the brain isn't fully developed. And so by the time someone's past 25, especially into their 30s, I mean, especially into their 40s, right? People have aged out of crime. They don't act impulsively, emotionally anymore. So that's just one. When you look at literally the safest if you're talking about safety, and again, talking like this language I'm talking about is like to someone like a governor or something, right? If you're really thinking about factually the safest population to release, then the numbers are right in front of your face. And the safest population to release are actually those who had lengthy or life sentences. So during Governor Brown here in California, over, I want to say close to 6,000, actually maybe even over 6,000, just to be short, definitely over 5,000 lifers, people who were once serving life sentences in prison, were released under Governor Brown. Now, that was whether through bills that were passed or his commutations that he did on his own. And the recidivism rate for that population has been less than 1%. Last time I checked, it was actually 0.08%. I think in the last year or two, it went a little bit higher. But as far as new crimes, none of those. Has been people shut their transitional home at 10:30 instead of 10 o'clock, right? For didn't check in with their PO. It's been a violation that has generated little and domestic violence meaning arguments with a girlfriend or a spouse. So can anyone hear me clearly? It says I'm breaking up. But my point is, like, as far as the safest population to release, factually the safest population are those who are serving life or lengthy sentences. Sadly, the highest recidivism rate comes from what people keep saying, and I don't use this language but for context, low nonviolent quote unquote offenders. And so the highest recidivism rate are for people with car burglaries, and then it goes into larceny and like property crime. Those are like the highest recidivist rates. And it's sad because, again, it goes back to employment and housing. They say 82% of people come back within the first year because of housing and employment issues. So again, people go into prison, they don't get the treatment that they need. They get kicked out right away. And I'm not saying to lengthen their sentences. What I'm saying is that there's proper care that should be taken for people, and prison shouldn't necessarily be that. But particularly for people who are there for a long time, like I said, factually, they are the safest population to release and not the most violent or population that people are supposed to be afraid of, that narrative that is put out in society.
Okay. And then also, Adnan, folks are asking for the link to your op-ed. Can you tell them like where they can find it? I think Zaina mentioned it's on your website.
So the op-ed that I was talking about earlier, I wrote last year. It was for Cal Matters, and I copy pasted it, but I'm not sure if people can click. Is that they can? I'll do it again, but I did it earlier. I just do it right there.
So if you ask that question, it's scroll up in the chat box and you should be able to find it. And then I think you have to copy the link and then paste it in your.
Okay. I just did it again, Zakiya.
Okay, thank you. And someone is asking about how do we educate the governor to use his executive power to release people. I know there has been some action by grassroots organizations with mentioning him on Instagram and Twitter and things like that. But I'm not sure if there is another level to that. But yeah, I would say to be on the lookout. I know Initiate Justice has posted about it. I'm not sure if Restore Justice has, I believe so, and other organizations. So be on the lookout for when we're kind of like calling for a collective action. And then, you know, is there a next step to trying to get to the governor in his ear? Adnan, do you have any advice?
I mean, sadly, I think this is all political. It's sad to say that he knows what time it is. He knows exactly what's going on. If I could build some context, when in 2016, first of all, Newsom, when he was lieutenant governor, came into San Quentin several times. I met him several times when he was the second in command when Governor Brown was governor. On top of that, one of the things that he did with his wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom. So Jennifer Siebel Newsom, his wife, is a filmmaker, documentarian. And one of the films that she did was called The Mask We Live In, which was about toxic masculinity. And not only were some of the people who were currently incarcerated were filmed and interviewed for that documentary, but she came back with Newsom into this prison and screened this documentary. And the whole thing was about violence. And the whole thing was about people who commit murder and life sentences. And so I just want to say that public safety and I'm sorry, not public safety, proximity, that whole, he knows all of this stuff. Like he know it's not, we can't educate him on this because his wife, I mean, I'm just saying like that's already done. So everything for me just is political. He has higher political aspirations. He wants to sadly, you know, become president and eventually. And another thing I like to make this distinction between Governor Brown and versus Newsom. So Governor Brown, he was, he commuted a lot of people. He was on his 8th year, his last term. He wasn't running again. He doesn't have or didn't have any higher political aspirations. He was 82 years old. He's done with politics. And so he did this mass commutations kind of towards the end of his governorship. And then even though Newsom was second in command lieutenant governor, here comes Newsom. And I think even for me, like I expected, or a lot of people expected, a similar trend and culture of commutations to continue. Sadly, it hasn't lived up to the hype that Governor Brown did. And also that's politically is because Newsom, it has higher political aspirations. He's not 82 years old. He's actually in his 40s, and he's you know, he is going to run again, and he's going to run for president. And so he's playing politics.
Yeah.
As far as the education, Zakiya, it's already there. It's just everything else is politics. So it's confusing and disturbing to me. Like, what's the next step for us?
Yeah, definitely had those conversations. He was my mayor in San Francisco, so I definitely know how he moves and operates. Let's see. So someone asked, how can we address end-of-tier officials from committing misconduct and corruption? Is this a factor in reducing overzealous prosecutors seeking convictions over finding the justice for both victims and folks who have committed an offense? I'm gonna unmute you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a question that folks ask a lot, but there really isn't a good answer to it. I think the answer is similar to how Adnan just responded about how we put pressure on Governor Newsom, because there really isn't any incentive for prosecutors, you know, not to stack charges. You know, prosecutors are incentivized to stack charges and to be like overzealous with prosecution, because they want, you know, for the most part, to pressure people into taking a plea deal versus actually going to trial. So yeah, like for myself personally, I don't put a lot of effort into like, you know, reforming you know, what is happening amongst district attorneys. I think that it's really important for us to change laws so that we don't have mandatory minimums. We need to like remove enhancements and alternative sentences such as 3 strikes, you know, from the possibility of, you know, ever being sentenced or prosecuted. And there's just like a lot of like really important, you know, policy work that we need to do, because the way that the system exists right now, there really isn't anything to deter folks, you know, from seeking convictions over finding true justice. There's no incentive for them to care about healing or accountability or redemption or actually promoting safety. It's just about winning.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a question, do you touch on post-incarceration syndrome or Norway structure when presenting to legislators, or do you focus on current statistics? My answer to that would be both. Different people react in different ways. Some people need like all the statistics, you know, they're logical thinkers, and some people you can appeal to their emotion because, you know, they're in touch with their emotions more so. So, you know, I would say that, you know, it depends. I know Taina talked about last week when they went to, they were presenting, I believe it was 965, and you know, she and Assemblymember Mark Stone, you know, kind of presented all the statistics and data and you know the text of the bill, and but then they had Richard there, and who gave his personal experience, and that was what really resonated with the legislators on the panel. So I think we got to hit them with both. I'm just going to take a couple more questions because there are literally a ton of questions in the chat box. So sorry, I did not expect to get all of these questions. Okay, as proactive family members, how do we address the Board of Parole who continuously deny suitability for nonviolent, non-serious institutional rule violations? Well, my personal thought is I think there needs to be some type of parole board oversight committee. Um, and I'm not really exactly sure how we can make that happen, but I think that there needs to be some type of accountability for the parole board. Taina or Adnan, do you guys have any feedback? I only see you, Taina. Do you have any? Let me see. Let me see.
I want
Adnan,
to jump in and say it would be exactly, my answer would be exactly what you said, Zakiya. Exactly. There needs to be accountability and oversight on the parole board. And I know that the question here also says, as a proactive family members, how do we address the parole board? That's the sad part, that by right, the victim's family is allowed to be there, but legally, your family is not allowed to be there. So it's that's such a difficult question to answer as a proactive family member. What can we do? I think what you said exactly is having oversight over the board, some type of accountability structure is super important. I don't know how to achieve that. I mean, obviously through the legislator, through policy, but the practicality of it right now is so crazy.
Yeah, I think that we can't physically be there and advocate for our loved ones, but we definitely we can propose legislation. As Taina was talking about last week, it's better when you do it with an organization and power in numbers. Taina, I think I saw your hand go up. I'm muting you. Is it unmute?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I just wanted to say I agree with everything that the both of you all said, but something that I also want to address, because I see in the question that they address denying parole for people who have nonviolent or non-serious institutional rule violations. I just want to be really clear that when we're talking about things like parole board reform or ending mass incarceration or talking about who is found suitable for parole and who isn't. I just want to be really clear that we're talking about freedom and liberation for everybody. So I wouldn't want us to start creating different categories of who is seen as more deserving versus less deserving of an opportunity to come home. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. I'm scrolling through trying to find one last question. So last question, can we briefly talk about the difference between statewide versus national incarceration policies and advocating for change in both? I'll quickly say something and then I'll pass it over to you guys. As far as the national incarceration rates, most folks are incarcerated in the state prison systems. And so if we kind of tackle it state by state, then we'll drastically decrease incarceration rates. There's a not a small percentage, but it's a smaller percentage in federal prison and a even smaller percentage in private prison systems. And so really the fight to end mass incarceration will kind of get us further if we tackle it at the state levels. But Taina or Adnan, do you guys have anything to add to that? So Taina, I'm gonna pass it over to you to kind of talk about our call to action.
For sure. Thank you so much, Zakiya, for facilitating, and Adnan and Monica for contributing. Really appreciate everything that y'all brought to the table. So in talking about taking action, what can we do now that we have taken some time to really understand the crisis that we're in around extreme sentencing, to learn about how different countries are approaching sentencing differently, and what we could potentially do here in California that would be a better solution. The question comes up now, all right, what can we do? It's a little bit complicated at the moment since we're going through this very serious crisis with COVID-19, and a lot of legislation is not moving through right now. So something that Initiate Justice and Restore Justice have talked about doing in the interim, while we're, you know, waiting for the next opportunity to introduce some serious legislation around ending extreme sentencing, is prioritizing, like shifting the culture, like shifting the narrative. As Adnan was talking about earlier, you know, we have to become really comfortable discussing difficult topics. We have to, you know, as he said, use the word murder. We have to be like very real and honest about, you know, what has happened for folks to end up in prison, but talk about, you know, just as much, if not more, the serious failings that we have within our system. You know, what happened to cause people to, you know, make those kinds of decisions or to make those kinds of mistakes? What does it look like when folks are in prison now who are fighting really hard to come home, to be reunited with their families? What are the success stories of folks who are coming home after serving really long sentences? Like, even just looking at the participants on the call now, like, I've seen so many people who have done, you know, years, if not decades in prison, and not just for, you know, the quote, like nonviolent, non-serious offenses. So what do we do to prepare the legislature and to prepare voters to, you know, be ready for some real radical policy change? So something that we want to do as a strategy is to start uplifting our stories and start presenting ourselves as part of the solution and not part of the problem. So something that we're going to start doing is collecting people's stories so that we can work on a multimedia project. We're also going to be working on a report where we're going to be talking about the realities of extreme sentencing and why it's so important for us to change these policies. So if y'all can see in the chat box, I shared a link to a Google form, and I'll actually send it again because I see there's some other things being shared. So what Initiate Justice is doing right now is we're reaching out to folks who have been impacted by incarceration. So if you are formerly incarcerated, or if you are supporting a currently or formerly incarcerated loved one, and you're willing to share your story to be part of this culture change project that we're going to be working on, please take the time to fill out the form. If you can go ahead and copy and paste it into your browser now, that would be great. That way you don't lose it when the meeting is over. But I can also share the form with everybody who RSVP'd for this webinar. So it's a short form. It doesn't have a lot of questions. You know, we're just asking like some like demographic data around like how much time you or your loved one were sentenced to. But then we're also just asking folks like to share a little bit about themselves, you know, who you are as a person, or, you know, who your incarcerated loved one is, you know, what they mean to you, the value that they bring to the world, and also talk about how their extreme sentence has impacted you and has impacted the community. And within the next few months, you know, with y'all's permission, we'll be including these stories in a report that we're going to be working on in a multimedia project that we'll be sharing on social media. And if you're interested in continuing to be involved in like the broader like narrative change work, please, you know, let me know. I'm going to drop my email address in the chat box as well. And if you're interested in, you know, staying involved in the culture change, narrative change work for the long run, you know, please let me know. And I think the last thing that I'll share about that is I really can't like stress enough like how important it is to share your story and how impactful that is on policy. That was the reason that our very first webinar was on changing the narrative and sharing your story. As Zakiya had mentioned earlier, on, you know, pieces of legislation that Initiate Justice has worked on, legislators really care the most about people's individual stories, and that is something that is like really powerful in you know, changing their hearts and minds and getting them to shift for how they vote on legislation. We did some polling for another piece of legislation that we're working on, and we tested a bunch of different messages, and the messages that tested the most strongly weren't necessarily any ideas or values. They were people's individual stories. So yeah, if you're interested, that's great. If you're messaging me in the chat box, I'm not going to remember that. Please email me, hyena@initiatejustice.org, and I will connect with you about sharing your story. Also, please fill out the Google form that I shared so that we can take the next steps for uplifting the story. So that is what I have for taking action. Adnan or Zakiya or Monica, I don't know if y'all have anything to add.
Nope, I don't have anything to add. I know there was a couple people who had said that they just want to become more involved with the organization. So please, if you are interested in sharing your story, copy that link that Taina put in the chat box and fill out that form. And if you are just wanting to be involved in the organization, please connect with us on social media, and also be on the lookout for how to become a member and when member meetings are, and things like that, because it's really going to take all of us to do this work and make the changes that we want to see and that we need for our families. So
yeah, and I'll go ahead and add to that. So yeah, if you want to stay involved, please continue to participate in our webinars. They're every Wednesday, 6:30 to 8 or 8:30 p.m. About a week before, we send out the information on how to RSVP. So in the next couple of days, expect to receive information on how to RSVP for next week's webinar, which is going to be on prison abolition. So if you want to learn more about the theory, about like what it means to be a prison abolitionist, please join us next Wednesday, April 29th. The following Wednesday, May 6th, will be our monthly Initiate Justice member meeting on Zoom. And that information to join our, or to RSVP for our member meeting will also be shared on our website and social media. So please follow Initiate Justice on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you want to learn more about the work that Adnan and Restore Justice are doing around ending extreme sentencing, please also follow Restore Justice on social media and check out their website. And the last plug that I wanted to make before we hop off, Restore Justice has launched a fundraiser so that we can donate masks to incarcerated people and staff inside CDCR facilities in order to try and help keep people safe during COVID. So if you are interested in donating so that we can purchase masks and get them to the facilities, I also just included the link on the Restore Justice website to donate towards purchasing the masks. 100% of those donations will go directly towards purchasing N95 and cloth masks for folks inside. And I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything about that, but I wanted to make sure folks had that. Oh, I need to unmute you.
Okay. No, I would just say that first of all, we've been talking to the specific facilities. It's not going through CDCR. It's going through like CIM, which is Chino, Lancaster. So we've been reaching out to individual prison facilities and working with them and ordering masks online through these donations and sending it into the specific partnerships with those facilities. So it's not statewide. However, and it's interesting because officers and incarcerated people, everyone wants it, so their administration is opening their doors individually. Taina, can I add about the you said sharing stories? I just want to highlight that one of the big things that when we talk about ending mass incarceration and specifically extreme and life sentences, the strongest narrative that's going to be out there, in my opinion, one of them is going to be from the victim/survivor's perspective. And a lot of us, sometimes maybe that if we've been affected by violence, if we've been affected by losing a loved one to violence, you are a survivor of violence. That is part of your story and who you are and who you speak for, because mass incarceration, I typed up the book it's called Until We Reckon by Danielle Surratt, who talks about, and basically ending mass incarceration, but she says, she speaks from survivors' perspective. She said that mass incarceration, the narrative was built on survivors' backs. And we as survivors, we don't want that. We want restorative justice. We don't want to harm people. We want this is a mass amount of people their stories aren't heard. And then those lines being blurred, for example, white victims are the only ones that are being heard by the legislators. And so we all need to come out and share how we've been harmed by violence and what we want from the people who have harmed us. Like, do we want incarceration? Do we want extreme sentencing? Or no, do we want treatment and healing for those individuals? So as we do these op-eds, as we come out more and more with sharing our story, try to dig in and see if you could also bring out those stories of survivors and how you've been victimized.
Yeah, thank you for that, Adnan. Great. So any of our facilitators have anything to add before we wrap up? Great. Well, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, let me unmute Monica. I think she was muted too. I don't have anything else to add. No, she's unmuted. Yeah, I just want to thank all of you guys for joining us this evening. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions again. But if you have additional questions, please reach out. We're on social media, and also I know there were some like personal questions in there, like asking about specific cases. And I think in a couple weeks, Caitlin's going to be on, so that might be a good time to ask those questions. Who she is a attorney who has an organization that advocates for our loved ones. So definitely tune in next week. Don't miss it. And talking about prison abolition, and then the member meeting, and then Caitlin. Monica.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you all for joining tonight. It was wonderful seeing all your faces, some I recognize. And tune in if you're interested in joining Initiate Justice. Please reach out. We want to have more people and end this fight of mass incarceration. And keep listening for these webinars. They're very informative, and you can find a lot of information. And thank you, and you guys have a good night.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Take care.
Good night.